Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding. His church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Welcome to another edition of the Q Podcast. I'm Gabe Lyons, and today I get to sit down with one of my heroes, Shannon Sedgwick Davis, and you're going to hear why in just a few moments, because she's somebody who has given her life to fighting back against injustice, and she's had to do this from several different places. I mean, she once was at the International Justice Mission. She leads a foundation, but what you're going to hear in this story is how she decided, she didn't want to just sit behind a desk and try to fight injustice. She actually wanted to go to the front lines and get involved in probably one of the most talked about injustices over the last 2 decades, which is the child soldiering problem that has been happening in Africa, where Joseph Kony has been for years kidnapping children, putting them with guns in their hands on the front lines of war at the age of 5 and on for many, many years. And so much has been done to try to stop this, and yet it seemed he just continued to stay in power. And so in this story, you're going to hear about how a professional leader decides to go take it upon herself to start leading this effort. And so join as we just listen into this amazing story from Shannon Sedgwick Davis, author of To Stop a Warlord.
This guy named Joseph Kony really has become one of the most infamous war criminals in the world, abducting children, putting machine guns in their hands, asking them to go out and kill people their age, to kill their parents, brainwashing them, moving them to do the most violent and harsh and tragic things that no child should ever experience. Hundreds of thousands of people have died in this area of Africa due to this war that has constantly gone on. Well, Shannon Sedgwick Davis, who's been a part of Q, she spoke in 2009 in Austin prior to taking on this latest charge. But in her own right, has been a philanthropist, has led a foundation, has worked with IJM, has done a lot of things in her career, but there's a particular moment where a conviction and a calling just set in on her. And I want us to hear the story of what happens when this all of a sudden comes upon you. What are you supposed to do when you're busy, when you have a lot of other responsibilities? She most recently, a few weeks ago, published a best-selling book called To Stop a Warlord that tells this story. And I wanted to invite her back. I wanted her to share with us her story since she was last with us of what God's done in her life and how he's used her to just be a part of an unfolding story in the middle of Africa. So join me in welcoming Shannon Sedgwick Davis. So Shannon, I've shared a little bit about this with everybody, but you had a lot going on, and then there was a moment where this tragedy that was taking place and unfolding and seemed to just never end in Africa was playing out. Why did you find yourself that you needed to get involved and take a more active approach than just donating money or getting somebody else to help? You decided to take an active role yourself.
Yeah, it really traces back to our foundation. I was CEO of the Bridgeway Foundation. We have a money management and mutual funds company that gives 50% of its profits to stop mass atrocity and genocide in the world. And in 2008, the LRA committed a series of Christmas massacres while people were off giving their Christmas prayers. And we looked at the grants that we had been giving in and around this issue area and saw that mass atrocity and really had to sort of look at ourselves in the mirror. And then in 2009, we had heard rumors that there would be a second Christmas massacre. And Christmas 2009 came and went. We thought no Christmas massacre, and I went up in March of 2010 to meet with a researcher that we had in the field. And she looked at me and she said, Shannon, actually, there was a Christmas massacre, and I've just found out about it, and I've just come back from collecting the evidence. It ultimately ran in the New York Times after that. But this idea that 321 people were killed again in another series of massacres, and that the world didn't know about it until 3 months later was deeply convicting. And it just felt like that was it. We either had to change our mission statement and say that we actually helped fund advocacy movements, or that we came in the aftermath of a mass atrocity. After the school was burned down, we gave funds to rebuild a school, which is incredibly worthy. Or we had to actually try and do what our mission statement said, which was to stop a mass atrocity. And that's what led to our intervention.
I know you wrote and have said before, I was tired of putting Band-Aids on bullet holes. How did that alter just your approach? And tell us more about the decision to say, we're going to move beyond just fixing things after a crisis happens to try to getting into the prevention work.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, it absolutely just felt like that's what we were doing. We were coming in the aftermath and putting Band-Aids on bullet holes. And when you ask yourself, gosh, do we want to actually try to be a meaningful part of stopping a conflict? I think initially your first answer is, well, no, like that's a private foundation doesn't belong doing that, private individuals. But then when you actually start to spend time on the ground, and we did with our partners, and do a lot of listening, you'll find that the local community has all the solutions. There's oftentimes just a few gaps, and there was, in this case, a couple of gaps that we looked to fill. One was an early warning network. So a lot of these communities that were losing hundreds of lives, they didn't have cell phone towers. They didn't have radio towers. So sometimes a community would be attacked, and then the LRA would move 20 kilometers and attack the next community. And so we were able to partner with a Catholic priest, Father Abbe Benoit, and help launch a radio network that now was available to actually give real-time information to villagers in terms of the LRA's movements. And then when you have that kind of information, you say, oh gosh, we know where they are, and we know how they're operating. You have to ask, gosh, is there something we can do about actually apprehension or bringing this to a close? And that's when we decided to fund trainers to train a special forces group within the Ugandan military, as they were already pursuing the LRA. And that really was the unconventional part, I think, of our participation.
Yeah, and I know you were flying back and forth, leaving your home and your kids in Texas and showing up in the jungles of Africa and trying to live kind of this double life. That was probably hard to explain to your friends. And sometimes I think these leaders, they're called into these places where it's hard to, even at home, to know how to talk to the people you go to church with, or you're spending time with them, what God's called you to do and how you're doing it so strategically. Talk a little bit, though, about the people that you were training there and some of the unsung heroes. You mentioned a Catholic priest that was helping on some fronts. Are there some other people locally there that just stood out? I know in your book you talked about several.
Yes, so many of them. I mean, one of the most incredible partners we had along the way is a man named David Ochidi. And in our book, we chronicle his journey alongside the story. David was born the year the LRA started. And at age 16, the LRA came into his village and kidnapped all of those that were in his village, him and his brothers. And then they took him and put him to gunpoint and said, who do you love the most, your mother or your father? And David's response was, I can't answer that question. I love them both the same. And they forced him to answer who he loved the most. And he said his father, and his father was killed there in front of him. That is the depravity of humanity that the LRA represents. And David was kidnapped, went into the LRA for 6 months, bravely tried to escape and was successful in escaped alongside another boy that was with him, and that boy was not successful in escaping. And David has now come out, and the first thing, instead of going into deep grief, as one might expect, David said, no, I'm going to do everything in my power to stop this and help bring the rest of my brothers and sisters home. And so David does this incredible work that we've been so fortunate to help support. The LRA has broken into really small groups, and they're across a 90,000 square kilometer radius. And so at any given time, you've got little groups of LRA individuals with additional kidnapped individuals, and they might be being led by someone who was kidnapped at the age of 6 and is now 26 and is operating and leading this group. And so most of the time it's someone who obviously never intended to join the LRA or be a part of the LRA. And we might identify that in a certain region where there's this dense triple canopy, thick jungle, that we think Sam Opio might be in that region. And so David will go back to the villages in Uganda and try to find Sam Opio's family, maybe a sister, maybe a mother, maybe an aunt, and record on his iPhone a message directly to them. Dwag Pacho, come home, my son. I've never stopped waiting for you. That's what one of the mothers has stated on the messages, which is so powerful. And then we'll plug them into these speakers that we have on our helicopter and hover over the region and just actually ask these individuals to come out. And the Ugandan military gave amnesty to anyone who wasn't a ICC indictee. And over that season, 730 walked out.
Wow, that is incredible. Awesome. You've said in your book, I've learned probably more from evil and suffering than anything else. What did that mean?
Yeah, I'm so fortunate to grow up. I was a youth pastor's daughter growing up in Texas, and so incredibly fortunate to grow up in a safe and loving home. And I just feel like I was surrounded oftentimes by the concept of good a lot more than evil. And then my work led me to places where deep evil was occurring. What we just talked about, David's story. David is just one of thousands and thousands. And I really had to wrestle with that. I had to wrestle with the idea that our God is a good and loving God, and that human beings are capable of that kind of evil. And in essence, my faith became much deeper because I wrestled with the entirety of it,
right?
But different. For instance, joy was harder for me to come by than ever before. Growing up, I think I had rosy-colored glasses and just seemed to be able to sense and feel joy much easier. And after doing this work, I was lucky to be a part of a group called the Elders, which was founded by Nelson Mandela, and Archbishop Tutu was the chairman of. And we were traveling in Darfur, and Arch, as I call him, we were in a refugee camp, and we were witnessing horrific things. And he was standing there, and I was watching him, and we were so sad. I mean, it was so horrific what we were witnessing. And he started to sing, and he started to dance. And then the rest of the community started to sing and dance. And this white girl had to try to sing and dance. And afterwards, when we were in our car on the way back to where we had set out from, I asked Arch, I said, Arch, what was that about? Like, you started singing and dancing in the midst of these people and them telling us these horrific stories. And he said, Shannon, I was crying inside. He said, joy has to be practiced. And joy is a discipline. And in thinking about joy that way and thinking about the promises, I think, in the scriptures about joy, I think he's absolutely right. And so that's just another way I think that my faith has been transformed is in the practice of joy.
Well, what a great way to encourage all of us about the practice of joy. Happiness is more of an emotion, but joy is a deeper discipline to experience in the face of tragedy. And you've seen it up close and personal more than many people that I know. And so thank you for your faithfulness to just keep walking forward in it, to keep fighting. I know this is one of those stories, and this is the hard part about the world that we're in, is you feel like you get some wins and then you have some setbacks, and you hope for one day it's all going to be solved, but you don't often see that in the immediate moment. It takes this long journey. And so thank you for being willing to tell your story, to Stop a Warlord, incredible book of her travels there and this incredible work as you're continuing to do your incredible work. So let's thank Shannon Sedgwick Davis for being with us.
If you want to hear more of Shannon's story, you can do that by getting her book, To Stop a Warlord, My Story of Justice, Grace, and the Fight for Peace, wherever books are sold. And it's an amazing story, isn't it? I mean, we got to hear some of it, and I love just how she helped us remember joy and how joy is a discipline, and how when we're faced with dark times, when we're faced with injustice, when we're faced with evil and the darkness in our world, that our response has to be one of hope and joy in the midst of those difficult circumstances. That is not easy to do. And I know for Shannon, this was a big part of how she's been able to survive this difficult journey. And so please continue to listen to her story, share it with others, encourage others that we all can be a part of making a difference in the world wherever we are. We're not too removed from solving problems. Now, as you think about the month ahead, I want you to remember October 24th. It's a very special evening in the Q annual calendar because it's the night where leaders come together, friends come together, people come together in their communities to talk about issues that matter, to consider how do we think well and advance good at the most local of levels. That can be in your family, that could be on your street, in your neighborhood. It can be with the team members that you work with. It can be with your entire church or small group. It can also be for your entire city. We'll have 75 locations gathering in cities, public settings, where not only do you hear Malcolm Gladwell, Francis Chan, and Rebecca Lyons deliver talks, broadcasts to all of us and all around the world, but you're also going to get to hear from local leaders, people who are trying to address problems and bring solutions to your community, just like Shannon did around the world. These are people in your own city doing the same thing, advocating for the rights and the justice for other people. So on that night, October 24th, look at qcommons.com and see if your city is hosting a large gathering in your city. If it is, please attend. Invite your friends out to attend. We all come together on that night. I get to host the evening, but we get to hear from so many different voices, and you get a chance to talk with one another, to hear how others in your city are thinking about these issues. But most importantly, to build friendship, to start to build relationships with other people who care about these same issues. In a world where we feel so connected, sometimes it's really hard to find the others who want to work together to solve problems in your community. And this night is a magnet for that conversation. So go to qcommons.com, learn more. If there's not one in your city, you can actually host it in your home. You can invite people over, have some apps, maybe have dinner, maybe order pizza, but come together and have a night you're going to dedicate to having an incredible conversation about how to advance good in our moment.